gentlemen, in regards to immigration, me and Matthew think the more, the merrier. Today, I'm going to discuss the freedom of movement and how we think that it stems the suffering which is going on in the world. I'll then go on to talk about why me and Matthew see the world's population as one entity and not as a dichotomy between they and us. Matthew is then going to give you some analysis on the economy and how it benefits under our model, and then he's going to go on and talk about why we achieve social harmony. So, what's our model? What are we proposing today? Well, frankly, we think anyone should be allowed in. Secondly, we're not going to give any welfare to these immigrants whatsoever. And thirdly, we think pensions are fine because you pay tax when you work for the economy, so therefore you're paying into your pension. That's cool. We're cool with that. So now, freedom of movement. What is the world like without it? Well, we think people can be trapped and oppressed by governments that they didn't actually vote for. We think this means that they have no way out, and this therefore creates suffering in the form of misery, in the form of danger, poverty, or harm. And this is a negative impact which shows how suffering has a negative impact and shows why we need to do something about it. So that's the world without freedom of movement. With it, people will then be able to move to a place that benefits them, where they're happy and when they can affect their future in a positive way. And we think that's good, and we think that's what we should work for on this side of the house. Now, me and Matthew think that the importance of freedom of movement arises, and the importance of immigration arises when there is suffering. We think that maybe when there is no suffering in the world, which is a very utopian idea, that the freedom of movement may in fact not be as important. But in the world that we live in the current state of affairs, there is a lot of suffering, and we think that calls for a large amount of freedom of movement that is needed and a large amount of immigration to help solve this problem. The status quo. There's poverty in Africa, debt in Greece. What does that mean? Suffering comes in all forms, not just one form. And there's suffering all over the world. We see it everywhere. So, now why is freedom of movement therefore necessary to combat this suffering? Well, we do have asylum and refuge criteria, but these don't encompass all forms of suffering. If I was to say that I hate my town, I'm hated by all my friends, and I'm hated by my family, you would probably think, well, that's probably a very miserable situation you're in, Cyrus. And you'd be very right to think that. And if I thought that by moving country, I could better myself, better my situation, and positively affect my future, well, that's something that I should most certainly take advantage from. Now, this arises by having a freedom of movement. If I wasn't allowed to move, my suffering would be unnecessary. Why is it unnecessary? Well, firstly, because it can be easily stopped through unrestricted immigration, and secondly, because, well, frankly, no one should be suffering in the world. We shouldn't have any of it. So that's freedom of movement, that's why we need it, and that's why we think it's pretty cool on this side of the house. So my second point, why do we see the world as one entity? Why do we see the world as one large group of people where we don't draw distinctions between who people are because of either race, background, class, or the country that they were born in? Well, firstly, the status quo restrictions on immigration have, to a certain extent, dichotomized the population. As I said, dichotomized them into they and us. And where do we see this? Well, we can see this quite a lot in England at the moment with the BNP political party and the EDL political parties. These parties are patriotic, nationalistic, and all they want is to better themselves, and they have no care for the others that come into their countries. This is abhorrent, this is disgusting, and unnecessary. It can be easily solved using our model today. When the immigrant comes into these kind of countries, they feel that they're against the population, not part of society. There's a lack of harmony, and Matthew is going to discuss how we will solve that lack of harmony. We think that the government has therefore a right to help all those suffering equally. Why? Because when the government sees suffering and does nothing about it, it becomes complicit in that suffering. Similarly to how there is a lot of discontent with how governments around the world are dealing with the situation in Syria at the moment, there would be a lot of discontent against governments who know that there is suffering going on around the world and do nothing about it. If you do nothing about it, but you know what's going on, you are almost as bad as those who are causing it. And that's why we think the government me and Matthew, have this moral duty to do something about it. We want to treat everyone equally and help all those suffering to as large extent as possible. So, what have we talked about today? Well, I've discussed the freedom of movement and how we're going to stem suffering around the world using the freedom of movement. And secondly, I've told you why we have this moral obligation to do so. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Cyrus. Answers, respectively, as concise and as short as possible, so we can have as many questions and answers as are possible during the period of 3 minutes. With that, I'd like to invite the second member of the opposition, Shreyas Ravishankar, to begin his cross-examination.
You ready, Cyrus?
Yes.
So, Cyrus, why is it okay for drug peddlers from Mexico to enter into the United States of America completely unregulated?
Sorry, did you say drug dealers?
Drug peddlers, yeah.
Okay. Well, they and criminals, to a large extent, we think are obviously former criminals. These are criminals or people that have already served their sentence, and we have trust in the global judicial system to have rehabilitated them after they come out.
Well, statistics show, Cyrus, that immigrants from Mexico are clearly more likely to get engaged in stuff like drug crime as compared to normal Americans. So if you're going to allow them to enter the country unregulated, don't you think it's a bad thing for, say, the United States of America?
I agree, Shreyas, but I don't think that it's because that they're Mexican that they're more prone to behave like this. I think it's the situation in Mexico which has made them this way. We think they'd be much better off in our country.
That this will eventually be bad for the United States of America.
Not at all. I think we have the power, we have the ability, and we have the capacity to help these people, help them out of the situation. That's the purpose of our motion today, to stop the suffering.
Okay, so then why is it the burden of a state, right, to ensure that an individual who isn't from that particular country gets this treatment, gets this welfare?
Like I said, Shreyas, if we know there's suffering going on and we do nothing about it, we could become complicit in that suffering. Me and Matthew think everybody in the world should be treated equally, so we're going to solve all suffering in the world.
So, do you believe... Okay, so going back to what you said about one population in the world, do you believe that people with different cultures can actually conform to one particular set of laws?
I think the way that we can manage that and have the world live in harmony together by appreciating our different cultures is through cultural exposure, cultural awareness, and learning about each other. And we're not going to do that by having restrictions on immigration and stopping people from meeting each other. Thank you.
Okay, so you seem to base a lot of your case on complicity, okay? So what I'm going to ask you is, why do you think, you still haven't proved this to us, why is it the duty of the state to ensure that an individual who isn't from that state gets this relief? Because you just stated that states are complicit in doing so, but we haven't really heard any analysis about this.
I understand. Old lady being robbed in the street, are you saying you would do nothing about it, or that you'd take an active role in stopping that happening? What we're doing is taking that active role.
The difference here is, the government has a duty to its own people as well, right? So there are two parties involved, not just one old lady, but say another one who happens to be closer to you.
We frankly see no difference between the people in our country and the people of the other country. We're all citizens of the world.
So you'd be okay with prioritizing the needs of an immigrant over the needs of a subject?
No, see, Shreyas, I said I'd see everyone as equal, not as prioritizing immigrants over our own people.
Ladies and gentlemen, me and Shreyas believe on side opposition that we should protect the state and safeguard the world. But before that, a rebuttal to some of the points raised by side proposition. Now, side proposition have come up to us with this panacea, this cure-all for all the sufferings of the world, but they haven't really given us any analysis as to how they're going to actually alleviate the suffering. Ladies and gentlemen, they've told us that they want to treat everyone equally, and yet their model states that they will not provide welfare for the people who are coming into the country. Ladies and gentlemen, this is ridiculous. You're saying you're treating everyone equally, and yet you're not providing them with welfare. I think that's double standards inside proposition. Please clarify. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, when you're not providing any welfare for the people coming in, you're leading to this statelessness of these people. Because they've come into a country, that country is not taking care of them, their host country is not taking care of them, these people have no one to take care of them, ladies and gentlemen. Who's going to take care of them? And we don't think that side proposition is actually alleviating the suffering in this case. But coming to two particular arguments that they've raised. First, on this notion of the freedom of movement. And they haven't given us any analysis as to why it exists, but we're going to tell you why it doesn't exist. First, freedom in general only exists when your actions don't cause suffering to the world at large, and when there are group identities which are not in conflict with it. We're going to prove to you today that this freedom of movement does not exist because there will be suffering and harm to the world at large. We don't think that point exists, and we're going to tell you how this harm comes about. And second, this concept of a world culture. And they gave the example of the British National Party. We don't think that a world culture necessarily exists in the world. We don't think that we're this big American shopping mall and we all can conform to one homogeneous set of values and standards. We think there's a reason why we have nation states in the world and why we're governed by different laws and different constitutions. And we're going to explain that to you. But coming to the specific example of the British National Party, we think that your side is actually giving more fodder to the British National Party because you're going to have a larger set of immigrants actually come into Britain and actually cause greater problems to Britain. You're actually worsening the situation, Cyrus and Matt. We ask you to not do that. And yes. But now coming to what defines a state. And this is very crucial to this debate. And how this side proposition is actually eroding this concept of what a state is. We think the four things that define a state. One, culture. B, boundaries. C, trust of its citizens. And D, ability to discharge its obligation to the citizens. And we're going to deal a lot with part D, and Shreyas is going to do that as well. But first coming to this concept of culture. We agree that there can be sub-national cultures, but we think history, language, and all these religion, all these form an integral part of culture, and that decides the boundaries of a nation. We think in Belgium that the Flemish and the Walloons have their own culture, no doubt, but they still have formed an integral part of this Belgian national identity. And we don't think side proposition can afford to neglect that when they decide what the state is defined by. And secondly, this ability of states to control their boundaries. We think territorial integrity is an essential point on side opposition. And one of the things that defines the state is its ability to control who enters the state and who doesn't. Because at the end of the day, the state is responsible to the people who enter it. And finally, and very importantly, the trust of its people. The reason why we don't have a world government today, ladies and gentlemen, a macro sort of government, is because the people at the grassroots would not be able to identify with this world government, because it's 6 billion people and one government. That's why we have localized government. That's why we have a nation-state side proposition. We think you're eroding this concept of a nation-state, and that's going to lead to a lot of damages, and we're going to talk to you about that. And finally, this ability of states to discharge a duty to its own citizens. And we're going to make this very clear, and we're going to rebut this point of complicity that they've raised up. A state has a primary obligation to its own citizens, ladies and gentlemen. More than anyone in the world, a state has its primary obligation to its own citizens. Why? Because of this argument of the social contract, where citizens form a part of a nation, and they give up some of their rights to ensure that the state protects them, safeguards their rights, and makes sure they're secure. The United States of America is responsible primarily to its own citizens, not to the citizens of the world. And in order to discharge this duty, they need to be able to control the people that enter and exit the nation. Shreyas is now going to talk to you about what harms are there as a result of this policy. He's going to talk to you about how this affects both the people coming in, the host nation, and the nation where the people are actually entering. He's also going to talk to you about crime rates and how this increases crime rates. We've already given you an example of the peddlers in Mexico. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, so I've told you today about how we're actually eroding the concept of the state and how this is going to have huge ramifications and how this point of publicity actually doesn't exist. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to oppose.
Could you tell us the 3 benefits of your restriction on immigration?
Cyrus, you haven't told us even one, so if the burden's on you to prove some benefits, I'll tell you something. It's called estopel, so where you maintain the status quo unless there's a reason to change it. We don't think there's a reason to change the status quo. The burden is on you to prove some benefits, not us.
I do believe that under the status quo, there is a lot of suffering going on all over the world in varied forms.
Absolutely, in the second speech.
And so, do you not think that by allowing people to move out of countries that they're trapped in, their suffering may be changed and may be bettered?
Yeah, it will become worse. I'm not going to cut into Shreyas' speech, but we're going to talk to you about how it increases crime rates and reduces standards of living in both the host nation. We're going to talk to you about brain drain. Wait for Shreyas' speech. Yeah.
You said in your speech that each nation should be governed by itself. Do you therefore disagree with the intervention that took place in Libya?
We think there are certain circumstances in which these interventions are allowed, but primarily the duty of the state lies with its own nation. We don't think it was necessary for the US to intervene. We think it was perhaps good that the Security Council intervened at the end, but primarily the duty of a government is to its own nation.
Isn't any form of intervention therefore a contradiction to what you said in your case?
No.
Okay. Why do governments have a duty to care for their own people over immigrants?
Because it's people who exist within the nation, it's people who have given up some of their rights to the government, it's people who vote governments into power, and therefore they trust the government. This level of trust between the people of the nation and the government, that's what we're respecting inside opposition.
Because they're voted in. So what about the minorities that didn't vote, say 49% that didn't vote? Are you therefore going to stop caring for
I
them?
don't think we're debating the technicalities of elections. We think it's a fundamental principle that democracy is the rule of a majority. We're perfectly happy, in fact, in the case
Rohan,
of South...
answer the question. Would you stop caring for them?
No. We're going to give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of South Sudan, where the minority felt disillusioned with the majority government, and it had a referendum and created its own state. We're perfectly happy for that to happen, as long as the integrity of the state is protected. We don't think you do that.
It's in Bradford, where minorities were killed by the people that live there, the locals. Do you not think this is a problem with the status quo and a lack of cultural awareness and cultural exposure?
Cyrus, the problem is suffering, but you're not really providing a solution to it. We're going to tell you that riots are going to happen even more under your model, because there are going to be more migrants coming in and more jobs being taken, and therefore there'll be more riots on your side of the house.
Will cultural awareness and cultural appreciation be developed under your model, where people aren't allowed to immigrate, or under our model, where people are?
Can I answer that question? Yeah. We think that awareness and globalization can't take place without people moving from there to there. We think the internet exists as a perfect means of communication to understand the cultures of other nations. You don't need to move from nation to nation to understand about the cultures of other nations.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Cyrus said, we think that with regards to immigration, the more the merrier. Now, before I move on to my substantive arguments, I would like to offer some rebuttal to what the opposition have said. Now, firstly, they asked if we knew the mechanism by which we could alleviate suffering. Now, I thought this was pretty clear when Cyrus came up and said, oh, well, he could be very unhappy, he could have his family, his friends, everyone in his local area hate him, and then he could move away. We think it stands that if you move away from the source of your suffering, you can alleviate it. So we think that that's sufficient mechanism for the alleviation of suffering. Furthermore, they said that our movement will actually cause more suffering. However, I'm going to actually prove to you today that it won't. Furthermore, in addition to this, they want to know how we can all adhere, to the laws of a given land. They cited culture, religion, ethnicity as reasons why we couldn't adhere to laws in a foreign land. This is an absolutely ridiculous statement, ladies and gentlemen. It was merely an assertion, and he didn't really analyse this at all, and he provided no explanation as to why this would be the case. I think the exact opposite is true, and regardless of where you live, I think that human beings have the capacity to adhere to the laws of the land. I'm not an Emirati, ladies and gentlemen, but I've lived here for 11 years, and not once have I been arrested. Clearly, I'm doing quite a good job of adhering to the laws. It's quite simple. Furthermore, they've also said that we were offered fodder to be MP. I'm going to prove that that, once again, is untrue. But most outrageously, the Speaker for the opposition got up here and said that you had to fulfill certain cultural criteria in order to be Belgian. Now, We think that this is absolutely ridiculous because, firstly, it's an arbitrary criterion. Why do you have to fulfill certain criteria to be Belgian? This could easily translate to racism. Some people might think English people all have to be white, they all have to wear top hats, and they all have to drink tea at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We can't base our society on these arbitrary measures. It's ridiculous to say that some people have to be a certain way in order to be classed as being from a nation. Now, moving on from the ridiculous, hopefully to the sublime, Cyrus spoke to you about why freedom of movement is important, why it does exist, and why the government, because it could be complicit, should offer freedom of movement. Now, I'm going to talk to you about two things. Firstly, the clear economic benefits of immigration, and finally, how this immigration will actually alleviate suffering in general and why it is a good thing for society. Now, the economic benefits. We think these are primarily twofold. We think that firstly, this provides a larger talent pool for industry. And secondly, we think that when people come to a country and they work, they pay tax, and this ultimately translates to more government spending and better services. Now, what does a larger talent pool do? A larger talent pool means that in vocations where companies could previously pick from 10 workers, they can now pick from a pool of 100, meaning that they have more talent to pick from. This means they can pick the 10 best as opposed to just being stuck with the 10 that they have. This should, we believe, translate to better efficiency and better business practices in the country, which should aid growth. Moreover, why is tax revenue good? More money for the government. This money spent by the government generally reinvested in essential services like healthcare and education, which I think we can all agree are objectives good. Now, why will social harmony be increased under our system? As Cyrus got up here and said, the status quo engenders an ideology of us versus them. There are locals and there are foreigners. And the reason that this leads to conflict, ladies and gentlemen, and the reason why the BNP and other political parties like them feed off of this is because they operate under the idea that the locals are more entitled. Now, when the government imposes immigration restrictions in a country, they are tacitly saying that some people don't deserve to be in this country. They're saying that the locals are more deserving than anyone else. This is why people feel grievances when someone from abroad comes up and takes their job, so to speak, even though they might have merits that mean they deserve that job more. And it's this sort of inclination which is the source of all conflict. And we think that eventually, if we remove all immigration restrictions, we can eventually dispel this idea of us versus them, because it will send the message out that everyone is equally entitled to stay in the country and everyone is equally entitled to be there. So, for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we agree, and I hope you agree, that the more, the merrier.
May I now invite the first member of the opposition, Rohan Sampath, to begin his cross-examination.
Matthew, what do you think will happen to the supply of labour in the United Kingdom if your policy is passed?
It will go.
In the United Kingdom.
Unemployment or employment, sorry?
Unemployment.
They will go up.
Alright, what do you think will happen to the suffering in the United Kingdom?
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because we think that if this freedom of movement is enforced throughout the world, I think that
yes or no?
I'll explain, sorry. If freedom of movement is enforced, people, when they are unemployed, have the option to unrestrictedly go somewhere else where there is jobs. So we think that this unemployment will only be a temporary thing, and in the long term, there'll be a form of dynamic equilibrium.
Alright, do you think, Matthew, that people are free to move around as they wish, leave their families, and just because they don't have jobs in one nation, move to another, just deciding one day that they want to move?
Under our policy, they would be, yes.
Where would they go actually, Matthew?
Wherever they wanted.
And if there's an employment, you said that all people would be entitled to stay within the nation. If you're not providing welfare benefits to the people coming in, don't you think they will feel a level of statelessness when they're within the nation?
Perhaps, but is this really essential that we have a state? As we've said in our speeches, there is a global community, and we don't think that the idea of a nation in particular is particularly important.
All right, so you think that there should be no body which is actually responsible and can actually take care of these people, and they can go wherever they want, but they won't have a body to take care of them.
Yes.
All right. What do you think will happen? Are you okay to have the government of Saudi Arabia actually impose its laws upon the United States of America, for example? Or how are you going to reconcile the differences between the laws of nations?
Can you explain to me how this applies to the case?
Yes, because we've told you that the concept of a state doesn't exist when you actually have free immigration. So you're basically going to have no states in the world, you're going to have a sort of world government. So you basically have to reconcile the differences in the laws.
Questions, please. You can ask only questions.
Yeah. All right. So would you have the government of Saudi Arabia actually impose those laws on the United States of America?
If the United States of America was obliged and happy to go and accept Saudi Arabia's laws, like immigrants would be if they went to another country, then yes, we think that would be fine. If it was done consensually.
Let's look at developing nations, all right? What do you think will happen to, will there be an influx and outflux of movement of people from developing nations?
That depends on the individual circumstances.
But what do you think is likely to happen? There are less job opportunities within developing nations. What do you think is likely to happen in those countries?
People will chase jobs, but eventually, if more job opportunities open up in these developing nations, then presumably people will go back.
All right, so Matthews, you think that people are basically commodities who can just move at free will, who can, sacrifice all that they have within their host nations, their cultures, and basically move wherever they want in search of jobs. And you think that actually alleviates their suffering by making them move in search of jobs from country to country?
I think it's your side of the house that views people as commodities, Rohan, because you don't allow them the freedom that they want. You have them accepted or rejected by countries, not based on their own will.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think there's been a very, very big assumption on side proposition with regards to our policy, right? They've assumed that we're banning migration, or immigration rather, completely. That simply isn't the case, right? We're telling you that it's going to be entirely the prerogative of a country to decide who gets in and who gets out. We think that's something they've failed to address, right? They've based an entire case on this wild scenario where no one is going to be allowed to enter a particular country. That's just untrue. Rohan's given you some analysis and we've heard some responses. I'm going to deal with some rebuttal right now. So we heard from Matt that there are going to be economic benefits to this policy. He says firstly there's going to be a talent pool for industry. Secondly, there's going to be greater tax generation. We say two things to that, right? So Matt himself gave us an example of how there's going to be 100 people to choose from and not just 10 people. And we're going to choose 10 people from that. That's a good thing. We say, what happens to the 90 people who just don't get a job? We think that's very, very problematic because now unemployment in itself is just going to increase. We think the notion that supply will create its own demand just doesn't hold true in terms of employment, right? People are going to be out of a job if we implement this policy because there's just too many people looking for that same job. We think that's just wrong. Secondly, if people don't get work, they aren't going to be able to pay taxes. We don't see how their policy stands in any way. So then in response to what Rohan asked him about unemployment in general, he said, Matt said, well, people are just going to move anywhere they want. We think that's also a problem, right? Because now you're just spreading these toxic deaths, right, of unemployment in different countries. We think this is going to create a domino effect of sorts, and it's just not going to be good for economies of the world in general. So then Matt told us about how he had a problem with Rohan's analysis about nation states. He's talked to you about how a global community is going to be just better for the world in general. We think Rohan's analysis has already dealt with that. Firstly, people of a particular nation or a particular group just will not trust the international community to the extent that they would a local community. Secondly, we think cultural differences are sometimes just very, very difficult to bridge. We think they need to be taken note of when you form governments that can make decisions on behalf of people. Right. So, my constructor today is going to be talking to you about why unrestricted immigration is bad. Bad, firstly, for the state that these immigrants go to. Secondly, bad for the state from which these immigrants move from. And thirdly, bad for the immigrant himself. So I'm going to deal with this individually. Firstly, why is this policy bad for the state that the immigrant moves to, right? So we think that in a large majority of these cases, immigrants move from one country to the other in expectation of a job, right? We think, though, that they're often mistaken. We think they often find like a squeezed job market in these countries. They often find it extremely difficult to find jobs in these countries. They receive either low pay or just no pay, right? There's problems with this. So now these people need to find living space. They need to find places where it's just cheap to live. They need to find places where they can live without paying much. So these people tend to congregate, right, and tend to form slums. Slum formation, ladies and gentlemen, is really, really problematic. Firstly, there's like a really poor standard of living in these slums, so there's really poor sanitation and lots of diseases such as cholera that are spread within these slums. We think that's a problem, right, for the state. We think these problems actually hinder the ability of a state to cater to its own people. Something that's very important, something that Rohan told you is the primary duty of a state. Why is this though? We think firstly, the formation of slums and all the associated problems just creates an economic burden on the state. The state now has to ensure that these people are also taken care of while taking care of the people who originally belonged to these states. We don't think states are often going to be able to do so fully because there's just a limit on which they can afford to spend money on. We think that's bad. Secondly, we also tell you that diseases that are often caused in these slums spread through the country. Cholera, for example, just spread through Zimbabwe, right, in the form of an epidemic. We think that's bad. The states have to spend far, far more on not just treating immigrants, but treating their own people. We think they're not going to always be able to do so effectively. Thirdly, poverty often leads to crime. Now that we don't have food to buy money rather to buy food, people are going to lead to crime. We think this affects not just immigrants in general, but society of a nation as a whole. We think the states are now going to have to spend a lot more money to deal with something like this, something that's extremely difficult for these states to do sometimes. Right. So that's why it's bad for the state these immigrants move to. Why is it bad for the state these immigrants come from? We think that these immigrants often move to developing nations to slightly more developed nations, where the expected income is just higher, right? We think this creates a brain drain of sorts. So these developing nations from which people move now slowly have very, very few resources to bank on to actually generate development within themselves, right? So even though these states have spent money on developing these people as children, for example, when they grow up, they're simply going to move away in search of better opportunity. So the state really gets nothing back for the money it's invested, for the resources it's invested. We think that creates a vicious cycle of sorts, where there just aren't going to be any resources for this state to use to develop. We think that's bad. We want to stop that. Why is this bad for the immigrant himself? Well, we think that he's just going to be subject to appalling living conditions, appalling employment opportunities, and he's just going to lead a very, very bad life. More suffering, not something Cyrus told you. Ladies and gentlemen, because we want to protect the state, because we want to safeguard the world, we beg you to oppose.
Of the proposition, Matthew Oliver, to begin his cross-examination of Shreyas.
So, in the status quo, people come to countries and they represent an even greater minority than would do in our system. Do you agree?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Okay, in the status quo, less...
Not always the case. We think lots of immigrants actually move from developing countries to developed nations, slightly more developed nations.
No.
They don't always form minorities.
No, but you accept that more immigrants would go to countries under our system.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and the prevailing ideology is that they're coming and stealing jobs as you've accepted. Don't you think that it's easier to persecute them when they represent a smaller minority?
Allowing these people to take other people's jobs in the first place. As Rohan's told you, we think the state's primary duty is to its own people, not to the immigrants. We don't want to take that risk in the first place.
But at the same time, you said that you wouldn't halt immigration altogether, so presumably someone
no,
would come
we
into
never
the
said that, Matt. We're saying that it's entirely up to the country to decide whether a person is going to enter the country or not. For example, if a particular country thinks that someone is financially capable enough to make a living in that country, the country is just going to let him in. We have no problem with that.
Exactly. And that one individual who would presumably work in the country if they're financially capable would be taking someone's job.
Yeah, but that doesn't create the other associated problems that we have as well, right? So we don't see why that's a problem.
Okay, never mind. Moving on. Okay. Why people would stay in slums if they have the option of freely moving somewhere else?
Yeah, because they're going to just face the same problem. it isn't just easy for us to assume, it isn't right for us to assume rather, that countries everywhere have the financial capabilities to take care of people no matter where they go. That's just a crazy assumption to make on your side of the house. They're going to face the same conditions almost everywhere they go.
Is it not equally ridiculous to assume that slums would suddenly pop up all over the developed world?
Not really, because, well, these people just don't have a regular source of income. We think it's just far more likely that they will that the result of this will be people living in slums to a greater extent than happens in our world.
Okay, one final question. You're defending the status quo, and you say that the status quo is okay to be maintained if there isn't a problem with it. Rohan cited that in his first speech. However, you also accept that this suffering exists in the world right now. So clearly, you must feel
the problem is that your policy just doesn't solve this. I've just shown you through my speech, and Rohan's shown you through his speech, while there are associated problems with allowing people to move from one country to the other completely unregulated, your policy just makes the problems that already exist far, far worse. That's
so what change would you propose?
Sorry?
So you do think we should change from the status quo?
Maybe we should, but certainly not according to your policy.
Okay.
So this has been an extremely interesting debate, and there's been a lot of points of contention. So Matthew and I have decided to group them into 3 different topics. So the 3 points of contention that we think there have been in the debate are firstly about cultural awareness and who increases it. Secondly, about global suffering and who increases it or even decreases it. And lastly, contention about the economical benefits. So, to deal with the first one, cultural awareness. The opposition told us that there are things such as cultural, ethnicity, laws of the land, things which mean that we can't live harmonically in a society which we weren't brought up in or that we are not part of. Shreyas told us that it's difficult to bridge this cultural gap, and Rohan gave us an example about how there's a criteria to be a national of Belgium. Well, no. As Matthew said, we think humans do have a capacity to live in other countries harmonically. And examples of that are all around this room, Matthew being one of them, as he said. This is an example of why we think Team Opposition's points about how we are not going to increase cultural awareness, all of them fall. We think that none of them have credit because there is an example all over the room, all over the world, about how we can live harmonically with one another. So the notion that by removing restrictions in immigration, we're going to have a larger BNP group, larger EDL groups, we think that's ridiculous. Those people are ignorant, have no cultural awareness, and that is our point. We want to get rid of it, and we will through our model. Then Rohan brought up this ridiculous notion that, no, wait, guys, the internet is a perfectly viable source of cultural awareness and cultural exposure. Really, Rohan, you think there's going to be large Skype and FaceTime sessions where people get on board and everybody talks to each other around the world? No, that's impractical, and our method is far more effective, and our method is far more basic on a grassroots level. You're meeting new people face to face from new cultures firsthand, not polluted by the filter of the internet. So, that's cultural awareness, and we think that on that point of contention, a lot of our points have far more credit and were far more viable than the opposition's. So, on to whether we're increasing or decreasing suffering. Well, we first came up to you and told you that suffering is all over the world. Opposition agreed with us. But they said that we exacerbate it under our model. Well, that's clearly fallible for 3 reasons. Why? We're providing the people with freedom, we're providing people with liberty, and we're providing people with an opportunity to do something that will better them, that will better their lives. And I think, given those 3 things, there is not one person in this room who thinks that will then lead them to make decisions which will increase more suffering and their own self-misery. We think, therefore, that point lies on our side of the case. We then went on to expand on that, giving you analysis on how the government is complicit in the suffering by not doing anything, and why, therefore, we have a right to do something about it. And now, lastly, the economy. Shreyas told us that people move for a job. We agree. They then asked us, does this mean unemployment's going to rise because a shed load of people are going to come into our country? Well, yes, if industry doesn't increase along with population. But that's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, it will increase along with population. And there's two reasons why. It's the competitiveness nationally and the competitiveness internationally of various businesses and industries. On a national level, there is a larger customer base and better skill sets for companies to take advantage from, so therefore competition will rise between them, and better quality of products, larger jobs, larger employment. Internationally, governments will then compete to have the best standard of living to keep their population at a high level. So again, we have more competition there internationally. Shreyas then said the state gets nothing back from these people because they're going to study here and move. Well, they moved for a reason in the first place, so I highly doubt they're going to want to move back to somewhere where they were suffering. So, ladies and gentlemen, because we win on the three main points of contention, cultural awareness, economical benefits, and the decreasing suffering, we think that we have won today's debate. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we've told you before, we inside opposition believe that we need to protect the state and safeguard the world. And we believe as well that this debate boils down to a few questions. One, whether this freedom of movement actually applies to this scenario. Two, whether the governments actually have this duty towards the citizens of the entire world, and whether they're complicit if they do not intervene in the suffering. And three, whether the status quo is better than the policy that they are proposing. And first, coming to this question of the freedom of movement. We've heard no analysis from side proposition as to why this exists in this situation. They've just told us that people are free and they want to be free and they're happy being free, and that's not analysis, ladies and gentlemen. That means people should be free to enter houses and trespass, and we don't think that's really justified. We've told you, on the other hand, that there are reasons that the freedom of movement does not apply in this case. We've told you that there are realistic harms from their policy. We've talked to you about crimes, unemployment, and the brain drain, and we think we win on this question of the freedom of movement. Now, coming to the second question on complicity. Once again, the side proposition thinks that people should be good beings and governments just have this duty to the people of the world. And we still haven't heard any analysis as to why they have this duty to the world. When the world doesn't elect them, the world has no part on the formation of the government. Why does this government have this duty to the world at large? We've given you analysis again on this question. We've told you how there's a vote and how in the social contract rights are given up to this government, and therefore they have an obligation to the people of their own country. And I think on this question as well, we win, because we think that governments have a primary duty to the people of their own nation. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, on whether the state has been eroded by their policy and why the state is important as a safeguard of liberty and security. We've told you about culture, boundaries, trust, and how states will not have the ability to discharge their own duty under their policy. They've just picked up culture and they've talked about that. We've given you three other bits of analysis, and we've told you basically why states are important to actually safeguard liberty and security. And then Cyrus comes up and says there are three reasons why their policy works. Freedom, liberty, which means the same thing, and opportunity in general. We beg to differ on this question. We're telling you on side opposition that in the cases of the host nation, in the case of the nation from which people are coming from, and in the cases of the people themselves, there is no freedom, liberty, and greater opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, honestly, when you enter a developed nation, when there's an excess of supply and there's not enough demand for jobs, we don't think that actually constitutes greater opportunity to improve yourself and actually have greater economic benefits. And we've told you how in the nation where people go to, there are greater crime rates, and there are greater riots as well, because there is a higher unemployment rate. But there's this entire bit of analysis that Shreyas brought to you about the brain drain, which I don't think was adequately touched upon by side proposition. We've told you that in developing nations, people are just going to migrate to developed nations. And so we see this vicious cycle in which developing nations actually become less developed year after year, and we have more people going towards developed nations, and those countries suffer as well. So you're not improving the living conditions in either nation, and Shreyas has made that very clear in his speech. And finally, of course, I think we've made this clear on the immigrant itself. The immigrant is forced to leave his land, forced to leave his culture and his roots, and then goes into another nation where he does not have enough opportunities to have a job. And we don't think this is really alleviating suffering, as that proposition calls this. We think it's exacerbating this. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, once again, we'd like to say, safeguard the state, protect the nation, protect the world.
Brings us to the end of the speeches. May I quickly invite the people.